Before a single frame was filmed, Doctor Zhivago was already caught in a storm that had nothing to do with cinema. Most people who watch this sweeping love story set against the backdrop of the Russian Revolution see only the breathtaking visuals, the tragic romance, and the haunting music. What they don't see is the extraordinary web of political danger, creative conflict, extreme physical conditions, and decades-long secrets that shape nearly every frame of the finished film. This is the story behind the story, and begins not in the director's office, but in the shadowy corridors of Cold War intelligence. The Central Intelligence Agency identified Boris Pasternak's novel as an ideological weapon years before Hollywood came anywhere near it. In the late 1950s, Western intelligence operatives saw in the book something the Soviet government feared deeply: a portrait of Russian life that was human, complex, and entirely at odds with the official narrative the Kremlin worked so hard to maintain. Working through carefully concealed back channels, the CIA arranged for the novel to be printed in small quantities and smuggled into the Soviet Union and other Eastern Bloc countries. Copies were passed hand to hand at cultural events and international book fairs, slipping past authorities who had banned the book entirely. The goal was straightforward, and the impact was lasting. Ordinary Soviet citizens were reading a story their own government had forbidden them to see. By the time MGM turned the novel into a film, that political charge hadn't faded. It had intensified, adding a layer of global significance that few Hollywood productions had ever carried before or since. The author himself paid an enormous personal price for what he had written. When Boris Pasternak was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1958, what should have been a crowning celebration of a remarkable career became instead one of the most dangerous moments of his life. The Soviet government viewed the award as a direct political provocation. Pasternak was publicly condemned, expelled from the Soviet Writers' Union, and subjected to a relentless campaign of state-sponsored intimidation. Colleagues were pressured to denounce him publicly. The pressure became so intense and so suffocating that he felt compelled to decline the prize itself. A deeply painful decision he expressed private regret over in the years that followed. His novel remained banned on Soviet soil, and his name became synonymous with defiance rather than literary achievement. He died in 1960, never seeing his story reach the worldwide audience it deserved, and never knowing that the film adaptation of his banned book would one day be seen by hundreds of millions of people across the globe. The legal path to making that film was anything but straightforward, because the novel had originally been published in Italy to bypass Soviet censorship entirely. The question of who actually owned the rights to adapt it was genuinely unclear. Multiple parties claimed ownership, and the situation was tangled enough to put the entire production at serious risk before it had properly begun. Italian publisher Giacomo Feltrinelli had released the original edition in 1957 and held firmly to his rights, while Soviet authorities refused to recognize the novel's legitimacy at all. Producer Carlo Ponti found himself navigating a legal landscape that resembled a minefield, competing claims pulling in different directions, no clear authority to resolve them, and the clock ticking. By the time director David Lean came on board, the rights situation had only recently been clarified enough to proceed. It was a fragile foundation for what would become one of the most expensive and ambitious productions of the decade, a reminder that even the greatest films can come within a signature of never existing at all. The casting of the film's central female role went through its own dramatic journey before arriving at the choice that would define the production's identity. Sophia Loren was the original vision for Lara, and with her husband Carlo Ponti deeply involved in the project's early development, the connection seemed entirely natural. But the pairing didn't hold. Creative and logistical complications made it unworkable, and other names began circulating, including Jane Fonda and Yvette Mimieux. None of them felt right to David Lean, who was searching for a very specific quality that was difficult to define, but immediately recognizable when absent. The role eventually went to Julie Christie, a relative newcomer who had not yet established herself as a major international name. The contrast with Loren could hardly have been more striking. Christie brought a natural, unforced intensity rather than grand Hollywood glamour, a quality that would prove to be exactly what the film needed. Even if not everyone involved could see that clearly at the time, the studio certainly couldn't see it. When Lean first expressed serious interest in Christie, executives at MGM were openly skeptical. This was a role that would anchor one of the most expensive productions the studio had ever greenlit, and they wanted a proven star attached to it. Lean had spotted her in Billy Liar, a modest British production, and something in her performance convinced him with absolute certainty that she was right for Laura. He pushed back against studio resistance with the characteristic stubbornness that defined his entire career, insisting that her particular quality of presence was precisely what the character required. The studio relented, though uneasily. Christie was in the middle of filming Darling when she was cast, a performance that would go on to win her the Academy Award for Best Actress almost simultaneously with the release of Doctor Zhivago. The timing turned her into one of the most talked-about performers in the world almost overnight, and what had looked like a gamble became one of the most celebrated casting decisions in 1960s cinema. Filming in Russia was never a genuine possibility. The Soviet Union had banned the source novel, and the prospect of a Western production crew arriving to recreate scenes of revolution and political upheaval on Soviet soil was simply not going to happen. Beyond the political impossibility, there were deeper practical concerns. Even if some form of access had been granted, Soviet authorities would almost certainly have demanded creative control over a production set during one of the most sensitive periods in their national history. David Lean was not prepared to accept interference under any circumstances. Several countries were explored as alternatives before Spain emerged as the final choice. Finland and Canada were considered for their winter landscapes. Yugoslavia was evaluated for certain locations, but Spain ultimately offered the right combination of locations: studio infrastructure, available workforce, and political cooperation. It was a practical solution to an impossible problem, and would demand extraordinary creative effort to make convincing. The scale of what was built in Spain to make that illusion work remains one of the great unsung achievements in Hollywood history. Near Madrid, a full-scale recreation of pre-revolutionary Moscow was constructed from the ground up. Streets, facades, storefronts, and architectural details were all designed from historical photographs and reference materials, assembled by hundreds of workers over months into a version of the city the production team could never actually visit. Production designer John Box oversaw an effort of staggering ambition. Tram lines were laid. Signs were lettered in Cyrillic. The detail extended far beyond anything the camera would ever fully capture. The result was a set so convincing that people who had never seen Moscow reportedly found it genuinely believable. It was an extraordinary logistical achievement that staged some of the film's most powerful sequences, including a protest scene that would eventually cause its own unexpected complications when local police, unfamiliar with the scale of production, reportedly believed at one point that an actual civil uprising was taking place. The leading role itself very nearly went to a completely different actor. Before Omar Sharif was ever considered, David Lean's first choice to play Yuri Zhivago was Peter O'Toole, who had worked with Lean on Lawrence of Arabia just a few years earlier. O'Toole turned it down, a decision that genuinely stung the director and cooled the warmth that had characterized their previous collaboration. The two never worked together again. When Sharif entered the picture, he came in with his own hesitations. He had been following the production closely and had expressed genuine interest in playing Pasha, the passionate political rival. The lead was a different proposition entirely. When Lean approached him about playing Zhivago, Sharif was genuinely uncertain. The role was enormous, present in nearly every major sequence, required to carry the film's emotional weight across a runtime of more than 3 hours. Lean persisted, Sharif accepted, and what followed was a performance so quietly human and so inseparable from the film's identity that it becomes impossible to imagine anyone else in the role. Nature itself became one of the production's most persistent opponents. A significant portion of the story depends emotionally and visually on the Russian winter, the frozen landscapes, the ice-covered windows, the brutal cold that shapes so much of the film's tone. When production moved to Finland and Canada to capture genuine winter conditions, the weather simply refused to cooperate. Unusually mild temperatures left landscapes bare when the cameras desperately needed them white. Schedules were reorganized, budgets absorbed unexpected delays, and the film's most visually distinctive sequences were at risk of never looking the way Lean had imagined them. The solution that emerged from this crisis was as inventive as it was unexpected. Marble dust was identified as the ideal material for large-scale artificial snow. It had the right texture and reflective quality to photograph convincingly under both studio and location lighting, holding its appearance across long shooting days in warm conditions. Vast quantities were deployed across outdoor sets and interior scenes. The frozen windows of the Varechino house, one of the film's most iconic visual signatures, were created using wax and other carefully applied materials rather than actual ice. Every element of the film's winter aesthetic was manufactured, and no one in the audience noticed a difference. The actors inside those manufactured winter scenes were enduring something quite different from what the frame suggested. Many of the film's most iconic cold weather sequences were filmed under genuinely warm Spanish skies. Cast members dressed in thick wool costumes, fur-lined coats, and layered period clothing spent long shooting days in conditions that made their wardrobe almost unbearable. Heat exhaustion was a real concern, and the crew worked to manage conditions as best they could within the strict limits of what the costumes required. The performance had to look frozen, while the body underneath was doing the exact opposite. What makes this detail so remarkable is how completely invisible it is on screen. The performances carry total conviction, and the visual design supports the illusion without a single crack showing. It stands as one of the more underappreciated physical achievements in the film, a sustained collective act of endurance that audiences never saw and rarely think to imagine. The visual language of the film was constructed with a deliberateness that went far deeper than most viewers realize. Cinematographer Freddie Young worked closely with Lean to control the film's color palette with near-architectural precision. For long stretches, the visual world of the film is dominated by gray, brown, and muted blue, the palette of exhaustion, cold, and political oppression. These are not simply realistic choices. They are calculated investments in specific moments that follow. The most famous example is a field of daffodils of Varechino, a sudden explosion of yellow that lands with something close to physical force after extended periods of visual restraint. Hundreds of thousands of daffodil bulbs were planted across areas of the Spanish countryside in careful coordination with the filming timeline, with the production team actively managing the blooms, storing bulbs in controlled conditions, and replanting in stages to ensure they appeared precisely when the cameras were ready. The sequence lasts only minutes on screen, but it carries an emotional weight that far exceeds its runtime, and it works entirely because of the visual discipline that precedes it. Behind the camera, the production was not without its own significant turbulence. Nicholas Reg began the film as director of photography before creative tensions with David Lean brought his involvement to an end. The precise nature of their disagreements has been described in various ways, but the essential conflict appears to have been one of fundamentally different visual instincts. Lean was absolute in his vision and uncompromising in his expectations. Reg had strong instincts of his own. On a production of this scale and complexity, that kind of friction was always going to resolve in one direction. Freddie Young, who had already collaborated with Lean on Lawrence of Arabia, stepped in and brought with him a working relationship built on mutual understanding and deep professional trust. Young went on to win the Academy Award for Best Cinematography for his work on the film, a considerable outcome for a role he had stepped into midway through production. The visual coherence of the finished film makes it difficult to detect the join, which is perhaps the most fitting testament to how completely he owned the work. The editing room faced its own monumental challenge. The raw footage gathered across the full production period amounted to well over 30 hours of material, one of the largest ratios of film content to finished runtime in major Hollywood history up to that point. Editor Norman Savage was tasked with reducing this extraordinary volume to something a commercial audience could actually experience, and the assembly cut alone ran to a length that was entirely unreleasable. Entire subplots were trimmed or removed. Sequences that had taken days to film disappeared completely. Characters who had substantial presence in early cuts were reduced to fleeting appearances. What survived into the final cut did so because it was genuinely irreplaceable, every remaining scene having to justify its presence against the weight of everything that had been discarded. The finished film runs to approximately 3 hours and 17 minutes. Somewhere in the discarded hours lies a version of the story the world will never see. The film's reception in certain corners of the international festival circuit was a pointed reminder that the political charge surrounding the source novel had transferred entirely to its cinematic adaptation. Soviet representatives and sympathizers Akin objected to the film's portrayal of the revolutionary period and its implicit sympathy for characters caught on the wrong side of history. The objections went beyond critical disagreement, extending to organized efforts to question the film's legitimacy as a representation of Russian culture. The controversy was ultimately unable to diminish the film's commercial and critical trajectory. It became one of the highest-grossing releases of its era and won 5 Academy Awards. But the festival tension served as a pointed reminder that Doctor Zhivago could not be separated from its political context, no matter how many years passed or how many borders it crossed. The music that accompanied the film ultimately escaped the cinema entirely and took on a life of its own that its composer could never have predicted. Maurice Jarre's central theme, built around a balalaika and instantly associated with Lara's character, was composed under considerable time pressure after the original choice of composer fell through. What followed the film's release was extraordinary. The theme was recorded by orchestras, jazz ensembles, and solo performers across dozens of countries. It appeared in advertisements, television programs, and live concert repertoires entirely detached from its cinematic origin. Jarre won the Academy Award for Best Original Score, but the music's legacy extended far beyond any award or any screen. Decades after the film's release, the melody remains immediately recognizable to millions of people who may never have seen a single frame of production it came from.